Okay, now, we were covering the Great Depression last week. You might remember I dropped in a hint that, ironically, a number of Americans, in fact 100,000 of them, actually applied for jobs in the Soviet Union at the height of the Great Depression in the early 1930s. I say ironic because going to the Soviet Union in the early 1930s was kind of like taking a one-way ticket on the death train. Not that, of course, anyone knew this. The reason they didn't know this, that's something I'm going to hope you understand by the end of today's lecture. That is, the obfuscation and lying about the Soviet Union was not simply a matter of lazy journalism. It actually did literally lead to many people throwing their lives away by emigrating to the Soviet Union, the height of its murderousness. So how did we get from one to the other? Now, when we left off with Russia, you may or may not remember some of the terms I introduced you to. War communism especially, and then also NEP, or if you remember in Russian it's Novaya Ekonomicheskaya Politika, which can be variously translated. I usually call it the new economic policy, although some people call it new economic planning. It's a matter of taste. Politika in Russian can be translated various ways. It doesn't make sense simply as politics, though. Now, what was the one and what was the other? Well, if you remember, war communism was defined not while it was happening, but after it happened. That is, once they had this, they said, okay, well, what we used to have was this. It was a way of distinguishing what they were doing from what came before. At the time, of course, war communism was just whatever the government did. They didn't have a name for it. And what they did was, remember, carry out the full program of, to define it most precisely or technically, maximalist socialism. That is to say, the full gamut of what you were supposed to do under maximalist socialism. Nationalization of everything, from the banks to private property, to buying and selling, eventually even to money. You remember that even money was abolished, along with the possession of gold, jewelry, watches, all the rest of it. Essentially, the government simply declared that everything was now state property, including, incidentally, I mean your brain, basically, because they said the thoughts you were thinking were now the business of the state. Now, if you remember, the result of that was not terribly happy. Some of it was because of the Civil War the Bolsheviks were fighting. Yes, that's true. But more fundamentally, it was a result of their policy. They literally destroyed the moneyed economy. They wiped out thousands of years of civilizational progress. People went back to barter and starvation. I gave you a few figures to give you an idea of just how extreme it was. You know, things like industrial and manufacturing indices down 80% or more. I'll give you a better idea of what it meant in human terms. The population of St. Petersburg, which was about 2.5 million when the Bolsheviks took power, dropped to about 700,000. Okay, so you're talking about the population. This is the capital. This is where the Bolsheviks live. It drops from 2.5 million to somewhere around 700,000. Now, not everyone died, mind you, but what did they do? Have any of you seen Dr. Zhivago or read the novel? They did what Dr. Zhivago did. They left for the countryside. This is actually a theme which recurs in communist history frequently. It was executed almost to parody, of course, by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, where they literally went to the city of Phnom Penh in 1975, in April. And they literally emptied the city from 3 million to 0 in the course of one day. Now, the reason, in their case, it was a little bit like they had taken everything all the way to the extreme, seeing all of modern bourgeois civilization as being ripe for annihilation. In that sense, the Bolsheviks were not as extreme as what would come later. Rather, it was a matter of the ultimate breakdown of all market relations. There was no food in the city. There was a whole category. There was a whole category that existed in the black market. The only thing which kept people alive were what they called the bagmen. The bagmen would just basically kind of smuggle in food to the city and sell it in exchange for whatever people had, which would often not be money since they weren't allowed to carry money. What you would have instead would be, let's say, a priceless family heirloom. I think I mentioned this example, a diamond brooch, kind of about the size of, let's say, this eraser, pure diamond. And you get like a bag of flour. That was the only thing which kept people alive. There was no grain trade. It had been abolished. In fact, so extreme was the problem that the government literally created what they called, if you remember, food armies. So people literally left the cities because there was nothing to eat in the cities. Now, it wasn't all that much better in the countryside, but you had a chance of maybe finding a small pocket of land where maybe the whites were in control, or where the Bolshevik measures had not been applied yet, or simply where they weren't paying attention, where you might be able to do some subsistence farming. The city of Moscow dropped similarly. You basically had the utter breakdown of civilization. So, that was war communism. Now, by, as I said, 1921, it had become pretty clear that, well, it didn't really work very well. The Volga famine was the most extreme example of this. This is when, as you remember, about 25 million people, according to regime propaganda, according to Pravda itself, were at risk of starvation, due largely to foreign aid in the form of Herbert Hoover's ARA mission. This is, remember, long before he was president. They saved probably about 20 million lives, but still 5 million people starved to death. In the cities, things were not that much better, but you may also remember the rebellion at Kronstadt, which I talked about. This was only one of a number of rebellions against the Bolsheviks at the time. This is the one that Trotsky put down. It was famous in part because Kronstadt was this naval base, out in the kind of the Baltic Sea near Petrograd or Petersburg, where the Bolsheviks had originally it had been one of their original strongholds, but they had turned so far against the Bolsheviks that they rose up. The Bolsheviks crushed the rebellion. They killed all of the mutineers. Trotsky organized the whole thing personally. Trotsky even took the wives and children hostage and had them executed. This was the most famous episode, but they were all over Russia at the time. There was a rebellion in Tambov province where they actually sent in the regular army, and they wiped out about 100,000 people just like that. You remember when I told you about what I called them, it kind of overlay all this period, the peasant wars. This whole period was one of basically a war after the Civil War was over between the regime and the peasantry, over essentially the food supply. It was very simple. I mean, if you think about it in Marxist terms, the peasants were sort of like this thorn in your side. They weren't supposed to be there. You remember, Marxism was largely a cult of modernity, of progress. Peasants were backwards. They were illiterate mostly. They believed in God. The new regime was atheist. So the peasants were an obstacle. They were in the way. And they also controlled the food supply. If you ever wanted to create socialism, which is to say a state-directed industrialized economy, you had to do something about the peasants. Well, so Lenin tried to do, but by 1921, he had failed. So NEP was essentially, as I have called it, a surrender. It was a surrender, a temporary truce with the peasants. They allowed, once again, the peasants to retain what they grew, to buy and to sell it, to even set the prices. They eventually re-legalized a lot of other things too, private trade, retail, buying and selling of real estate, municipal property in cities. Basically, it was like the re-legalization of capitalism. No one was really happy about it. Lenin had a phrase, you might have heard this one, 2 steps backwards. Or what is it? One steps forward, 2 steps backwards. They had all these kind of like funky phrases. They would try to describe it. You have a slogan basically. But in the final analysis, they failed. They failed, and they had to admit that they failed and they lost, they surrendered. So slowly the economy begins to kind of recover and emerge from the Dark Ages. Things do not go anywhere near where they were before the revolution, much less before the war, but market relations begin to pick up. There are a few goods in the stores. There's even a new class. The bagmen, in a way, were replaced by this new class they called the NEP men. It was not entirely unlike what happened in the 1990s in Russia. it was sort of like a criminal capitalism. It was like comrade criminal, because market relations were still so distorted. Everything was still so unclear. You needed heavy security. You needed guns and weapons. So it was like a mafia economy. No one liked it. I mean, even in Europe, you may remember I mentioned that the socialists and the communists denounced this as a betrayal of socialism, which of course it was. Now, meanwhile, behind the scenes politically, the other thing about this, it's not just a political failure for the regime, but in a way it's sort of like Lenin's epitaph, because by 1922, Lenin has his first major stroke. One of his last actions, actually, was to inaugurate the great assault on the church. Now, I mentioned this briefly, but it does tell you again something not only about the nature of the regime, but also the economic problems created by the regime. Now, the famine was kind of eating away, that is, at the strength of the peasantry. The peasants were strong enough, they had to have a truce with them. But even so, Lenin wanted to get rid of the peasants. He also wanted to get rid of religion. He actually issued a memo, one of the last things that he actually, like his last, not will and testament exactly, one of his last written directives. He told the government that now was the time to assault the church, by which he meant literally go into the churches, rip out the bells, steal the silver, steal the gold, take the icons, take the service books, rip it all up, melt it all down, and sell it. Now is the time to do this, he said, because the peasants are too busy starving to resist us. This is what he actually said. And that is what they did in 1922. Although, interestingly, almost everything Lenin did kind of prefigured what Stalin would later do. When Lenin sent people into the churches to rob them and loot them and shoot any priests who resisted, what Stalin did 10 years later was he simply dynamited the churches. He just blew them all up. So they both had similar intentions, but they carried them out in slightly different ways. This is one of the last things Lenin did. By 1923, Lenin was basically a vegetable. I mean, he really was no longer a fully sentient being. He would emerge every so often out of his quasi-coma-like condition to say something about Trotsky or Stalin. And there's all this speculation. What did Lenin really want? No one really knows, because he was really a vegetable. But it's kind of a false question anyway, because he was no longer in charge. Stalin had already begun to take over. Now, Stalin, like Trotsky, had made his bones, so to speak, in the Russian Civil War. Both of them were responsible for colossal atrocities. Stalin, his most famous contribution was telling everyone not to waste bullets. You should simply drown your enemies, and so they would just put them in the river and drown them. That's what he did in Tsaritsyn, later Stalingrad. He was also rather brutal in the Caucasus. None of the Bolsheviks were angels. They were all murderers. So there's no difference in that sense. Stalin's advantage over Trotsky, though, there were a couple of advantages. Trotsky, to a certain extent, did have the loyalty of the army. He was the overall commander. But by the end of the Civil War proper, which was really back in 1920, they began slowly unwinding the army. It was still there, but it was no longer as important. Meanwhile, they were expanding, of course, the secret police. The NKVD, it would later be called. At this point, it's a little confusing. There are all these different names you see, like Cheka, there's later GPU, there's OGPU, NKVD. Of course, we later knew it as the KGB, FSB. It's basically the same animal. It keeps changing its spots. And this organization was expanding massively. It now had hundreds of thousands of members. It had special branches to deal with peasant resistance, counter-revolution, and everything. The army, it was not that it was gone. It just was not as important anymore. So Trotsky probably was a little complacent because he thought he had the backing of the army. It turned out the army didn't matter very much. And he later renounced his command anyway. The real advantage Stalin had, he wasn't as intelligent as Trotsky. He wasn't as good-looking as Trotsky. He wasn't as glamorous and sexy as Trotsky. He didn't give as good speeches as Trotsky. But none of that mattered. Because in the end, what Stalin did, and this is really true of all kind of totalitarian governments, although Hitler's was a little different in this regard, Stalin controlled the bureaucracy. He did this very simply. He controlled what they called the Orgbüro, which is they have all these contractions. Basically, it means the Organization Bureau. In layman's terms, it means hiring and firing. So Stalin got to decide who would get hired, who would get fired, who would get promoted. Inside the Communist Party, that is. Really boring stuff, frankly. Trotsky, in a way, that was his real disadvantage. Because he was so good at giving speeches, because he had kind of taste. You know, he spent a lot of time making sure that, you know, he had all of, like, the Tsar's former butlers serving him and all the rest of it. He had style, basically. Stalin had guts, and Stalin also had the capacity not to be bored by paperwork. The nickname, they called him Comrade Card Index, or in Russian it would be Tavarish Kartotyakov. You know, that is, he had all these little cards, he kept track of the other party members, he decided who would prosper and who would not prosper, who would fail, who would rise up, and who would be sacked. So very slowly, Stalin begins asserting his control over the party. One of the key episodes was simply the death of Lenin. Stalin, because he was in Moscow all the time, also Petersburg, he was able to keep an eye on things. He was able to organize in Petersburg the kind of elaborate funeral ceremonials which followed Lenin's death. This was actually, I'm sorry, it wasn't Moscow. So Stalin, he kind of put together the whole extravaganza, the whole idea of embalming Lenin. You've seen probably pictures, if you haven't seen it, of Lenin's tomb. The whole idea of kind of turning it into a cult with everyone venerating Lenin like a saint, like a relic of the church. They were atheists, but they realized most Russians were not atheists. They needed some kind of, you know, ceremonial in their life, something to believe in. So he began immediately erecting this personality cult to Lenin, which was, of course, later very convenient to him, because once people got in the habit, then they erected a personality cult to Stalin. But anyway, Trotsky, bizarrely, kind of didn't get involved in this. He didn't even attend the funeral, and this was one of his first big mistakes. Stalin began organizing opposition to Trotsky, first in the higher ranking areas of the party, particularly in the party organization in Moscow, and Petrograd, Leningrad, it's now called. And anyway, so gradually he begins moving against Trotsky. Now, what did that mean? Communists, you remember, were nothing if not political. They had terms, labels for everything. Trotsky was seen as, they called it the, quote, left deviation. That is, he was on the left. What did it mean to be on the left? They're all on the left, of course. They're all communists. But still, you can be either further left or slightly further to the right. Now, Stalin's allies, it was mostly a so-called triumvirate of Stalin, Kamenev, Zinoviev. The way they kind of pitched this, though, it was as if there were two political alternatives. The right was represented by Nikolai Bukharin, who was more of an intellectual, really, than Stalin. He was like a theorist type. I mean, he wasn't an angel either. They all had blood on their hands. But he was more bookish, kind of. You know, he would actually read books. Stalin was not quite as bookish as he was. He wasn't as into ideas. Trotsky, the left. What did that mean? Well, there was another phrase, which Trotsky and his followers, who still, of course, exist today, their sort of slogan is what they call permanent revolution. Contradistinct to the Bukharin slogan of, quote, socialism in one country. Okay, it all sounds very kind of opaque and arcane. What does it mean? Well, permanent revolution means more or less what it says. You're supposed to strive for revolution now, but also everywhere. So on the one hand, no patience, you want it now. On the other hand, it's supposed to happen everywhere. And you're supposed to help it happen. So you're supposed to work for revolution in Paris and Berlin and New York, Washington, wherever. You're supposed to work for revolution in your own country. Everyone is supposed to work for revolution everywhere. So that in the immediate Russian context, that meant that NEP was a mistake, because this was, after all, a retreat. You know, one step forward, two step back, or two steps forwards, one step back. You're not supposed to step back. You're supposed to keep moving forward. And you're supposed to do it faster, quicker, and more thoroughly. So Trotsky wants to move. Trotsky wants to go immediately to full-scale socialization of the economy, which means you have to move against the peasants, which means you have to get control of the food supply, which means you have to begin building heavy industry, you have to begin industrializing. You also have to do it in such a way that agriculture is nationalized, The full gamut of full socialization of the economy, you must begin now. Well, as some of us know, Stalin eventually did decide that's what he wanted to do. But not until he had blamed everything on Trotsky and eliminated him. This, in a way, actually is reminiscent, some of you might remember from last term, of what happened right before the fall of Robespierre. Robespierre moved against the left, the people who wanted him to go faster. And he said, no, that's crazy. We're guillotining too many people already, and so I'll cut off your heads. And then he moved against the right, and he said, well, you say I should slow down, but I say there's still enemies out there, and so I'll cut off your heads too. Now Robespierre, though, he didn't really time it quite right. In the end, they cut off his head too, of course. Stalin somehow had the knack for this sort of thing. He moved against Trotsky first, and then he began organizing opposition to the people that had helped him move against Trotsky. And he took them one after another, Kamenev, Zinoviev, and then finally Bukharin. And he dismissed them as too tentative and too much on the right. Oh, so what this meant, incidentally, socialism in one country. Now, in literal sense, it meant you try to build socialism only in Russia and you don't worry about the other countries. So you don't try as hard to overthrow the governments of the world. You remember they also have this institution called the Comintern, or the Communist International. Now the Comintern is involved. It has parties. It also has like secret intelligence and spying apparat in all of the European countries, in addition to Japan, the US, also certain countries in Northern Africa. So it exists, and you can either use it to try to overthrow governments, or you can kind of tactically calm it down a little bit if, let's say, you want to have a deal with France over something. Then you tell the communists to shut up for a while so you can deal with the real French government. So it goes back and forth a little bit. This idea is sort of like you cool it a little bit. You don't try too hard to overthrow the governments of the world because they might oppose you more. You sort of lull them to sleep a little bit. And you work on building socialism at home. Now, in practical sort of doctrinal terms, it also meant you were supposed to let NEP, that is the new economic policy, play out a little longer. Ultimately, it had to do with this question of capital formation. Now, the communists, true, they were not businessmen, they were not capitalists, but they still knew something about capital, which they thought they had learned from Marx, which was that, of course, to build industry, you needed capital, which is to say, money. You can't build a great big factory, and they wanted to build really big factories, like bigger factories than anyone had ever seen before. The cult of the big, the cult of the modern. You couldn't do it without money. But where were you going to get money? I mean, the country was like broke practically. In fact, they had all this gold that they inherited from the old regime, but the gold was actually gone by February 1922. They actually spent the entire gold reserve of Tsarist Russia. They laundered it in Sweden. They spent it between May of 1920 and February of 1922. After that, it was gone. They had no more gold left. The economy, remember, was in ruins. Now it's sort of recovering. But it's not like they have a lot of export industries. Traditionally, Russia exported, of course, oil. It exported furs that you would make like coats with. It exported timber. Now, all of those industries are slowly recovering, just barely, but they're still kind of barely off the ground. A bigger problem, though, is this. They still haven't figured out the peasant question yet. It's like that, you have that itch you keep scratching and it just won't go away. Yeah, the peasants had started to grow food again. Food had started to show up in the cities a little bit. But still, the peasants were not giving up their produce, at least not enough of it, to, let's say, fuel the creation of a vast industrial proletariat, which would, after all, have to eat. In fact, by the later 1920s, by around 1927, it was really clear by 1926, although the crisis didn't become acute until a bit later. You started again having food shortages in the cities. They had this term for it. Again, they would always come up with some fancy-sounding explanation. They called it the scissors crisis, which was supposed to mean like scissors, that like prices of this are going this way and prices of that are going this way, by which they meant something about grain prices and manufactured prices. It was a really fancy way of saying that basically nobody was producing anything that the peasants wanted. So the peasants didn't want to give up their food because there was nothing they got in return for it. They'd get money, but there wasn't anything you could buy with the money. I mean, that's the big problem with money. Money is a nominal thing. Now, money is of no intrinsic value itself. Money helps you buy things. It's a medium of exchange. If there's nothing to buy, it's useless. That's why economies in these kinds of crises tend to go towards barter, that is, goods being exchanged. But now there was nothing to barter either. Industry, such as it existed, it was producing crud, and it wasn't even producing very much of it. So there was nothing the peasants wanted. So they weren't giving up their grain. And so yet again, the government had the same problem on its hands, which had faced Russia in 1917 because of the inflation, which had faced Russia in the Civil War, which had faced Russia in the early 20s. It had kind of quieted down for a few years, but then it had come back like it inevitably had to. So now, Stalin, having gotten rid of both the left and the right, decided that he would sort of merge the two ideas. He would have a permanent revolution in one country. He took a little bit of the left and a little bit of the right, and he said, okay, I'm going to do it my own way. Well, what did he do? It's not as if there was a very clear plan. I mean, these things always sound much neater when you look at the kind of the dates and the facts than they really were. In fact, even the first 5-year plan, which they announced, they didn't really start it until like 3 months later, and then they said, well, we actually started it in November 1928, which wasn't really true. What was a plan anyway? What did a 5-year plan mean? It was this big term you kept hearing again and again in the years of the 20th century. Not just socialist governments, but even Hitler in Germany. And then eventually, even some of the Western countries started talking about plans. Well, what it supposedly meant was that Russia in the next 5 years would, catch up in terms of heavy industry. Things like steel and coal. The ultimate goal, and I think this is abundantly clear from the evidence, was to make a lot of tanks, basically. They wanted to make a lot of tanks so that eventually they could spread the revolution abroad. To do so, they obviously needed a highly developed steel industry. They needed a lot of smelting. They needed to make sure they were producing enough coal, energy, electricity. They needed manufacturing, components. But basically what they really needed was a lot of tanks. But how would they do it? You've got two problems. As I've said, they've got no capital, they've got no money, and they also have no food. That is, they have nothing to feed the workers with. So, this is what it means then to, quote, build socialism, revolution in one country, to socialize industry. You need to find some way of raising capital. You also need to get control of the food supply. Control away from the peasants who you don't trust. So there are a couple of things you have to do at once. I'm going to start with the capital because it turned out that was the easiest. They had sold off all of their gold. They had started mining some, so they had a little bit more gold now. But what Stalin literally started doing was he sold off paintings, like from the Hermitage, and he sold most of them to the Americans, which again you might see as ironic in a homeland of capitalism. In fact, one man alone, you may remember him from last week, Andrew Mellon, if you did the reading, that is. He was the Treasury Secretary under Coolidge and then Hoover. Andrew Mellon, actually, in the year 1931, I think it was, he was actually the single largest buyer of Soviet exports in the world. Like, he bought almost half of Soviet exports personally. What were they? They were a bunch of paintings by old European masters, like Titian and Rembrandt. And he actually paid something like $6.6 million for all of these paintings, which frankly were a bargain at the price. He also claimed them as a charitable deduction on his tax return, which was really, really cynical. But anyway, so they sell off things like old books. They sold the Codex Leviticus Bible to the English government for £100,000 sterling. So they're dumping, in other words, art and antiques, things like old samovars and things like that. They're dumping all of this stuff abroad to raise capital that they're using to pay for industrialization. They also, interestingly, keep this in mind. They continued exporting grain. That is, once they had enough grain to export, even while everyone in Russia was starving to death. And that's because they wanted capital. Okay, so that's how they raised the capital. They didn't really raise enough, but they raised enough to get things going. And basically what they did is they hired Americans and Germans to come in and plan their factories for them. That was one of the oddest things about communism, is the whole cult of America, which never really went away. Industrialization was absolutely inspired by what the communists thought the Americans had done. In the same way, their agricultural policy was inspired by what they thought England had done to agriculture. And then they also read about the world's largest farm, which was in Montana, of all places. And this is what led Stalin to come up with this idea of these colossal, factories in the countryside. But so how though, were you going to get control of the food supply? Remember, that's really the key. The rest is not going to work unless the workers have something to eat. They're not going to have something to eat unless the government controls the food supply. Okay, so what they did first is they just did what Lenin did before. In other words, they sent armies out in the countryside and they started requisitioning grain, at gunpoint. It didn't work very well. They got a little grain, they stirred up a lot of resistance, they kind of restarted the civil war in the countryside. It didn't work very well. They tried that for about a year, like from 1928 to 29. Then they finally decided that what they really needed to do was to go full bore, to do sort of the full Marx. If you remember in the Communist Manifesto, there had been this phrase. Marx had talked about the rise of what he called industrial armies in the countryside. Now, admittedly, Marx was not very specific about what this meant. I think Stalin, again, supplied some of the content from what he thought he had read about some humongous farm in Montana. But the idea was to literally send armies out into the countryside and then create these enormous cement factories called collectives. The term they would eventually come up with was, this is the Russian term, was the kolkhoz. But this is the idea then. They are going to collectivize or socialize agriculture. They had then a specific goal in mind, and there was a specific decree which envisioned it. The decree, rather, shall we say, suggestively, was, quote, this is January 1930, on measures for the elimination of kulak households in districts of comprehensive collectivization. Now, what did that mean? Remember, they're getting control of the food supply. They're building factories in the countryside. To do that, you have to, of course, get rid of all of the small family farms, that is, the peasants. You need to take the land from them. You also need to take their produce. And you need to put them all onto factory farms. Now, the thing which was standing in their way was, as they called it, quote unquote, the kulaks. Now, this is a key term. You should definitely write it down and remember it. What it literally meant in Russian was fist. It was like this. So that in a kind of literal economic sense, it didn't mean very much at all. It had a connotation in the countryside, something like usurer. That is, a peasant who loaned money to other peasants. That's what it kind of traditionally meant. But for the communists, it meant something more. It meant you were a capitalist exploiter. Lenin had used this phrase again and again. Some of these decrees did not emerge until after the fall of communism, but Lenin would say things like this, direct quote, "I want you to hang the bloodsucker kulaks. Hang them up by their fingernails so you can see them for miles and miles around." They are, that is, the peasant rural version of the capitalist of kind of communist hate propaganda in the cities. Supposedly, that is, they represent rural capitalism which is going to be destroyed by collectivization. Now, how did they define it? They actually did define it. What made you a kulak? There were a couple of categories. There were about 3 categories. Basically, if you employed labor, that is, if you were like a successful farmer, and you had someone on staff, even part-time that you paid, that made you a kulak. If you owned a cow, that made you a kulak. If you had property above a certain level in terms of like your holdings or your land, that made you a kulak. But then, of course, there were other kind of more nebulous categories, like if you aided the government, or if you refused to aid the government in rounding up the kulaks, then you were a kulak. If you resisted, then you were a kulak. Basically, you could become a kulak based on your behavior as opposed to based on what you supposedly did. Now, pretty much everyone, after a certain point, became kulaks because everyone began to resist. The reason they were resisting, of course, is because all of these thuggish-looking men carrying guns, many of them machine guns, came to their land and stole their food and threatened to shoot them. Well, what would you do? You would probably resist. What a lot of them did, the kind of resistance which was most devastating, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Let's say you hear that, like, tomorrow the government is going to come and steal everything you have. Let's say all of your cows, your grain, your pigs. What might you do to prevent them from having the satisfaction of stealing it from you? Kill them. Maybe you'll have one last feast, but that's what they did. So in one fell swoop, basically, everyone just started killing all of their livestock, even burning their grain so the government wouldn't have it. So then the government came in and saw all this resistance and labeled everyone kulaks. And so they started deporting them. Now, when they deported them, I mean literally, they deported them. What they would do is, like, they would have these cattle cars. They would label them meat. Usually, you'd be crowded in such a way that, like, the shorter people, their feet would be off the ground because, like, they were so tightly packed that literally they could not stand. And this would take place, of course, for days on end, for weeks, and you'd end up somewhere, presumably in Siberia. So they started deporting the people who were resisting. Now, and meanwhile, the food supply was dwindling, of course, because the peasants have stopped growing grain and they've started to destroy what they have and they kill all of the livestock. And so, what do you think is going to be the natural result of this policy? Famine, right? People starve again. Now, the famine, we don't really know exactly when it dates to. We know that it peaked in about 1932, 1933. We also know that at the height of the kulak, the dekulakization or the collectivization campaign, we know that about 10 million peasants were deported. Eventually, there were about 20 million in the Gulag camps. About 10 million of them were deported in this period. So you're talking about 10 million people deported, labeled meat, you know, in these coal cars, sent away from their homes, never to see them again. You also have to remember that the people being deported, oh, and incidentally, the worst category of kulak wouldn't even be deported. They were just to be shot. Now, these, of course, were the people who actually knew how to farm. They were the people who knew what they were doing. They were the good farmers, the successful ones. So what the government basically did is they took the most productive regions of the country. Now, Ukraine is usually what you hear. It wasn't just Ukraine, but it was most intense in Ukraine because that was the greatest grain-growing region, the kind of breadbasket, the Black Earth region, and also because there was political resistance there. So it was like a two-edged sword. That's why the Ukrainians refer to this whole phenomenon. This is like their own version of the Holocaust. They call it the Holodomor. The Ukrainian famine, that is, of the 1930s. I'll get to the numbers in a moment, but the way they remember it, that is, it was a kind of Holocaust because it didn't just literally destroy people's farms and their lives. It ruined an entire way of life, which never came back. It just never came back. The private farm never did reemerge in this region. One of the reasons why it's still so poor to this day. But meanwhile, the government's propaganda, meanwhile, was so sinister. Because they kept encountering resistance, they eventually had to come up with kind of slogans and concepts to get people to cooperate. And so they created a cult around a figure called Pavlik Morozov. Now, who was Pavlik Morozov? He was a small boy who denounced his parents as kulaks, thus leading to his parents' death. This was then encouraged. Now, as it turned out, he was actually killed by his grandfather, who was angry that he had turned in his parents to certain death. And so he became a martyr to the cause. And they actually erected like statues and memorials about him. So here was the idea then. You encourage people to denounce their neighbors, their parents, to the government so that they can be deported or shot. So that the people who remain are sort of like the weasels, basically. But they are the people who will, of course, cooperate. When you finally do build these so-called collective farms, the industrial armies in the countryside, which they eventually did build. Agricultural yields, of course, took years to recover. In fact, they never would recover to where they were in 1913. But in the meantime, how many people died? I don't really know. I've seen different figures. As far as like the number who actually were shot or simply starved in these years, at least 5 million. There were about 10 million, again, deported. Probably of those, a good 30 or 40% died. So you could add another 3 or 4 million. So you're probably looking at about like 8 to 9 million dead directly. But then, of course, the whole population, 15 million, are pretty much ruined. Interestingly, they did a census of the population in 1937. You remember I talked about the census in 1922 and how there were like 25 million people missing? This time, there were only about 15 million people missing. But of course, this whole campaign was supposedly a great success. They actually described it in Pravda. They had a headline they called, "Dizzy with Success! Yes! We have collectivized 2,400 new farms! Dizzy with success!" And so they thought everything was going well, at least the people who were dumb enough to believe the propaganda. And so when the returns came in, that there were 15 million people missing in this census, Stalin, with this kind of grim, black sense of humor, had the census demographers arrested and sent to the Gulag for, quote, "treasonably exerting selves to diminish population of USSR." I kid you not, it's a true story. But meanwhile, the darkest and in some ways the most disturbing aspect of this phenomenon, at least to the West, was this. I said at the beginning of this hour that all of these people in America were volunteering to go to work in this country. Now, how could that possibly be that they were so deeply misinformed about what was going on? Well, they may have read the New York Times. The New York Times, there's a reporter called Walter Duranty. He was actually awarded the Pulitzer Prize. This is the most prestigious prize in American journalism for his reporting on Soviet Russia in the early 1930s. Some of his quotes: "There is no famine or actual starvation, nor is there likely to be." A French writer, quote, "There is no hunger in the Soviet Union." George Bernard Shaw, you may have heard his name, playwright. "When I visited Russia in 1932, I did not see a single undernourished person, young or old." Meanwhile, here are a few people who actually opened their eyes. Vasily Grossman. He was a Soviet writer. "There were people who cut up and cooked corpses, who killed their own children and ate them." Lev Kopelev, another Russian survivor. "I saw women and children with distended bellies turning blue." I think it was Arthur Kessler who said that some of the small children who were starving looked like embryos in alcohol bottles. So how did you get these writers and intellectuals and journalists saying the one thing, and people who were saying exactly the opposite thing? Walter Duranty, curiously, apparently once told the British ambassador in conversation, when asked whether there had been starvation, he said, "Oh yeah, sure, probably about 10 million people died." But that's not what he wrote in the New York Times. Why not? Why did he lie? Why do journalists lie? I mean, it's a really good question. It's sort of a rhetorical question. In the case of some of these people, the American ambassador Joseph Davies, who is a good friend of Walter Duranty, and he lied just as incessantly to the US government. I know why he lied. And that's because the Russians allowed he and his wife to buy up lots of paintings and icons at really cheap prices. They were corrupted directly by the regime. Some of these other people, like Shaw, some of the French writers, I know exactly what happened. They had a whole phenomenon. Trotsky actually coined the term somewhat sarcastically. He called them poputchiki, the fellow travelers. People who aren't exactly communists, but like they always want to be on the side of progress. And so you just tell them what they want to hear, and they'll believe it. So what they would do with some of the more promising ones, they would bring them to Russia, and they would take them on guided tours. You may have heard the phrase Potemkin village. A Potemkin village, or Potemkin is the Russian pronunciation. It's an old phenomenon. I mean, it predates the communists, and you even saw it in the 1990s. Like when there'd be a big conference, they would seed the clouds so it wouldn't rain, and they'd sweep all the bums off the streets. They would literally sort of present people with fake smiles to lie to these visitors. They would show them, some model factory where everyone was happy. They would let them stay only in hotels where there was, of course, like imported food. So in the case of a lot of these people, they did believe their own eyes, but they were, of course, shown only what the regime wanted them to show. And they didn't want to dig deeper. Who knows why? They just didn't want to dig deeper. And so this is what the New York Times was reporting. Now, incidentally, it's interesting that even today, the New York Times apparently has a meeting every year when they decide whether or not to give back Walter Duranty's Pulitzer Prize, now that everyone knows the truth. Thus far, they haven't given back the Pulitzer Prize. I don't know why. I do wonder, though, what the New York Times is telling us about today, which is manifestly untrue. It's always good to dig deeper. We're going to take a short break because we need to transition ever so slowly to Hitler. There's so much to cover. Does anyone have the time? Is it the end of the first hour?
Yes, please.
Okay, good. So about 10 minutes. It's only 30 past, I hope? Okay, 10 minutes, and then we'll pick up with Hitler.